Welcome to Engaging Culture, a podcast presented by Bridgeway Christian Church. I'm Brian Kiley. On today's episode, Pastor Lance Hahn and I welcome Roseville Police Officer Lieutenant Kelby Newton and Sacramento County Sheriff Deputy Mitch Andrews to the program. Given all that's happened in our world in the last few weeks, we wanted to bring on some members of the law enforcement community to talk about how they're processing everything, what changes they want to see happen, and how the Christian community can support our law enforcement community. All of that and more on this episode of Engaging Culture. Well, hi everybody. Welcome to season 4, episode 1 of the Engaging Culture podcast. I'm Brian Kiley, joined as always by Pastor Lance Hahn. Lance, can you believe it is season 4? We've been
what, does this make us older? Is that the problem? I mean, everything's going by so fast. What do you mean season 4? I thought we just started this thing.
I know. It feels like, well, it certainly feels like we're still figuring it out. So
that's
got that.
Man, I'm excited. Honestly, I got to tell you guys real quick. The two gentlemen that are with us, long time at Bridgeway, and these two gentlemen I respect very, very highly. So you can go on with your introduction, but I wanted to make sure they love me more than you. Go ahead.
Excellent. Well, I think we have established that. And with no further ado, really excited for our conversation today and grateful to be able to welcome Lieutenant Kelby Newton from the Roseville Police Department. Thank you, Kelby, for being with us today. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And as we commented before we came on, Kelby is in uniform today. I don't know what a pastor uniform is, but he is definitely looking the best of the four of us. That is clear. And then we also have Deputy Mitch Andrews from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department. Mitch, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. It's a honor to be here and engage in this conversation with you guys.
So we obviously, as I mentioned in the open, there's just so many things happening in our world, and I think on the podcast and in different elements of kind of Bridgeway's life, we have talked through a lot of these different social and cultural issues, and I think a lot of us have engaged in conversations with members of the law enforcement community privately, but we have not had the chance on this platform to have a public conversation. And I really see this as an excellent opportunity just to hear from the two of you and to hear your heart. As Pastor Lance mentioned, you are longtime members of the Bridgeway community, beloved members of the Bridgeway community, and public servants who have been serving our community in your respective capacities for a long, long time. So I'm very excited to learn from you today and to learn from your perspectives. But before we get into kind of the specifics of just your own thoughts and your processing of kind of the moment that we're in, I wonder if maybe the two of you, and we'll start with you, Kelby, if you could share just a little bit of your background in law enforcement, how you got involved in law enforcement, and then kind of what positions you've held over the years.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on today. So I've been with Roseville for over 23 years. It's the only agency I've ever worked for in law enforcement in the sworn capacity. Before Roseville, I worked for the California Department of Justice for about a year while I was in college. When I came to Roseville PD, the assignments I've held, I've been FTO. I was on the SWAT team, worked in our detective gang division. I later ran that team as well. I've ran our investigations team. Currently, I'm a patrol lieutenant and a watch commander in our patrol division. Been going to Bridgeway since 2004 when we're still Roseville Hope. And I think our church was located right next to a CrossFit gym. Who actually at the time was owned by someone here at the police department, but a little small piece of
history.
But yeah, I've definitely my family and I enjoy Bridgeway, and we definitely call it our home. And thanks for having me.
Awesome, thank you very much. How about you, Mitch?
Well, when I graduated high school in '84, I had a large interest in going into law enforcement, but I intended to go to the military first. So I looked at military police. The training was all full for the classes, and it would delay my entry into the military for a year. So I did a different career in the military, aviation. And then when I got back to Sacramento after a few years in the military, I started seeking out a career in law enforcement. Got hired on with Sacramento County in 1990. And during my 28 active years, I'm still with the department as an on-call reserve. So I get called in up to 6 or 7 days a month if they need me in a deputy capacity. But during my 28 active years with the department full time, I did nearly 5 years in our custody facilities. I was a jail training officer, rotated to patrol, and I was a patrol officer and a patrol training officer. I went to the Citrus Heights contract when that started in '97, and I ended up on the traffic unit there as a motor officer, promoted to sergeant while I was there, and was the supervisor for the traffic unit there. Then the sheriff pulled me out into the county to run a high impact team in the county on motors, which I did for a few years, and then went to internal affairs as an investigator in 2007, I believe. And I was an internal affairs investigator for 5 years. The undersheriff pulled me up to be his assistant after that. And most people probably are curious about what the undersheriff really does. There's a lot on his plate, but part of it is employee conduct review and discipline issues. So I was basically in the same internal affairs investigation and review process, dealing with those kind of cases for another 2 years. And then from there, I went to our threat assessment unit, supervised that, was promoted to lieutenant, spent some time as a field watch commander in our central division, and then finished my career as a lieutenant as a bureau commander for our civil bureau.
You got all that, Lance? Can you just repeat that back for us real quick?
Yes. In the beginning, there were dinosaurs, and I wanted to be an officer.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Hey, before we go any further, I wonder if maybe, Lance, this wasn't part of our pre-plan, but I wonder if you could just share a little bit as these gentlemen who are part of our Bridgeway family have shared about just their own careers in law enforcement. Bridgeway has a long history of involvement with the law enforcement community. Could you just share a little bit about kind of your own heart for the law enforcement community and just ways that Bridgeway has sought to come alongside and support both those in law enforcement and their families?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces. One is that even in my own family, I have law enforcement in my own personal family. My brother runs the entire criminal division of Reno and in Washoe County, and so once again, that's part of my family. So for whatever reason, at Bridgeway, we have a rather large law enforcement and first responders community, and that ended up stirring up some ideas on how can we minister to our community, how can we love on first responders. We ended up getting tied in along with Francis and Fuso and The Rock in hosting the police and firefighters banquet annually, where we are able to hand out awards. So our church sponsors that in a very significant way, along with some other community sponsors. And so we have a very large, kind of fun, elegant dinner for first responders that allows them to be able to honor one another and get some recognition. So we do that every year. And then along the way, we also have had a significant amount of training in our facility on our campus, which allows K9 units to train and drone units to train and SWAT team units to train. And so we've also had connections with the county as well. So we have an awful lot of interaction with law enforcement as part of the Bridgeway community.
Yeah, no, we sure do, and it's awesome to be able to partner in all of those different ways. Now, Kelby and Mitch, I want to hear from you, and I want to give you the opportunity to share this with our listeners. What is maybe one element, or let me phrase it this way: what is a misconception maybe that the general public has about what it's like to work in law enforcement? Because I've seen a couple seasons of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, so I just assume I have a very accurate picture of police work just from that. So could you maybe set the record straight for us? We'll start with you, Kelby, and then Mitch. What's a misconception? And it could be something funny, it could be something serious. It's sort of up to you. What's a misconception that the public has about law enforcement work?
I think it's not always what you see on TV and in the movies. There's a lot of calls for service that the men and women in law enforcement handle daily that would never make it on a movie or on a TV show. And it's definitely essential that we handle those type of calls for service, but they're not glorious. It doesn't show the downtimes of officers, having to write reports for hours on end, maybe dealing with family disturbances and the after effects of dealing with that and how it just wears on the men and women in law enforcement. I think that's probably one thing that's probably not spoken about enough, is just officers. They show up every day. Officers, deputies show up every day, and they can handle pretty much any call for service, and it can take you anywhere from one call to the next. And that's really the interesting part about the job, is you can go to a family disturbance and potentially have to take someone into custody for that. The next call could be a parking complaint, or some kind of a disturbance elsewhere, or someone in custody at a convenience store or something like that, where it just from call to call, it can be so dramatically different.
Yeah. Wow. How about you, Mitch?
The biggest misconception the public has is that we all like donuts.
I like donuts.
I don't know if you guys saw the meme on public social media recently, but it was a line of bicycle patrol officers, and they had their bicycles lined up in front of them as kind of a skirmish line. And all the people on the other side had fishing poles with donuts hanging from them, and they were reaching over the skirmish line with it. I thought it was hilarious. I would have laughed at that.
Yes.
Go ahead, Lance.
I think realistically, the biggest misconception, I think, is American TV and movie has done law enforcement a real disservice in painting an accurate picture. If you sat through a 2-hour movie and you allotted the time in the movie as a percentage of what happens in police work, you would have like 2 minutes of action and probably an hour of paperwork, and then you would probably have another 30 minutes of sitting around. And I'll probably get into that in our next question, the emotional roller coaster that officers end up on frequently, and the toll that takes on them.
Yeah, just to highlight, getting a snapshot for any of you that are fascinated and interested in trying to understand what it's really like. Sometimes there is allowances for the community to do what's called ride-alongs. And so I had a chance to do a ride-along at Roseville PD. I had a chance to do go in and join SWAT training with Citrus Heights PD and do a couple different of these connections. And when I was on the ride-along in Roseville, our first call was about a neighbor trapping the other neighbor's cats. And you should have seen the officer's face when the call came through. He was trying to be really polite, but it was a little rough on his spirit of going, I'm sorry, I'm going where? And then we were doing traffic stops, a bunch of different things. And then we were serving a warrant in a domestic dispute. And so everything that they were just talking about, the one thing about the paperwork that I think is really, really important for a lot of people is that sometimes there's the impression that officers get to do whatever they want to do. And what is intriguing is they have to write on everything they do, and nobody gets into law enforcement to say, I wish I could write more reports. But wow, the paperwork is over the top. So I just had to highlight that for these gentlemen.
Well, and that could potentially be a lead into the next question, which is a bit more serious. Just what for you is one of the most difficult elements of law enforcement? Because I think different ones of us could maybe guess, but for the two of you who have served our community in this capacity for now decades, what's a difficult part that maybe the public doesn't see or the public doesn't understand? And Kelby will start with, or okay, Mitch will start with you, then Kelby.
Sure. So for me, it's something that was rarely talked about when I first came into the career and has been more widely recognized and spoken of lately. Dr. Kevin Gilmartin wrote a book about it. It's called The Hypervigilance Roller Coaster. And essentially, anybody that goes into law enforcement, you have to recognize that when you step out your door, you're still a staying human with the same morals, the same values, but your awareness and preparedness for the unexpected has to increase. And that puts you in this hypervigilant state all day long when you're on patrol and you're working. You have to keep your eyes open and pay attention to what's going on, or you could suffer harm or death. It's a serious issue. And when you come back home and you take your uniform off, you don't just turn into same old you. you dip below this normal line that normally your stasis is at, and it's a depressive state. And anybody that goes into law enforcement has to deal with this. If you're not hypervigilant at work, you're putting yourself at harm, but it causes a real emotional issue when you get back home.
Wow.
Powerful.
Wow. Yeah, that is powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Kelby, how about you?
So I think to kind of dovetail on that, in the book that Mitch referenced by Gil Martin, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, one thing that I think that a misconception is that people feel like, or they don't understand, it does take an emotional toll. In the book, it talks about your buckets, and your buckets become full. You see so much pain and sadness over the years, going to family disturbance calls, suicidal subject calls, death investigations, crimes against children, stuff like that. I think the misconception is people feel like it's very easy to turn that stuff off. And at heart, we're all human, and that affects everybody in different ways, but it's all negative in how it affects people. And over time, you just keep the analogy is this bucket, and you keep putting little drops in this bucket, and finally your bucket gets so full where it's over full, and you do not process and or do the job like you're supposed to do. It does wear on you, and that is definitely I think a misconception that people don't understand, is law enforcement officers are not just robots and can just shake that stuff off. It definitely does have a long-term effect on you.
Yeah, let me highlight one thing just to bring this alive, is that if you and I, which are non-law enforcement, if we went to somebody's house and we saw a child being harmed in a very significant way, we would probably tell that story for the rest of our lives because it marred us.
Yeah.
That's an everyday.
Yeah.
And putting on a badge does not allow that to drain out any quicker. You have to learn how to process it. The same thing about the extreme vigilance is the same thing that creates from soldiers in combat that creates things like PTSD. The undiagnosed PTSD in all first responders, whether they are in an ambulance or they are in the fire department or they are in some other form of law enforcement, PTSD is very, very high because of emotional trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that's, and I'm really glad this has been brought up on just the different ways that all three of you have spoken to it, because I think that the reality that, yeah, when you put on your badge and then you come home at the end of the day, you can't just switch that off. Right. And it's so easy when we lack proximity, or our only engagement with law enforcement is seeing you around the community or seeing you in an official capacity. It's a little bit, I think, embarrassing. And we all do this to each other in various, I think it's not just a law enforcement thing, but just the extent to which we just think, oh, well, that person just has their job and they do it, and that's just sort of it, without realizing, okay, there's a real cost to this hypervigilance. Okay, there's a real cost to the things that you're seeing and the things that you're doing. And my hope would be, even for our listeners, as we process this together, just that would increase our sense of empathy for the reality of what the two of you and people like you face when you're out and you're doing the things that you do, because it's critically important for us to understand that. Now, part of the reason we're having this conversation now is anybody who has not been living under a rock for the last month knows that there's been a lot about law enforcement in the news with the George Floyd tragedy and some other things. And I really just want to hear from the two of you and hear just some of your heart on how you've processed all of this and kind of what's been stirring in you since that happened. So I wonder if you might be willing to share with us just briefly, when you first heard the news, and Mitch, we'll start with you and then go to Kelby. When you first heard the news of what happened to George Floyd, what was your initial reaction?
Initially, I had a real sick feeling. This is the first incident like this that I recall in my career was the Rodney King incident, which happened March of '91. I was just on the department about a year, and that incident happened, and we all remember the fallout of that incident. And there have been countless incidents like that since then. And these all, for me, they fill that bucket that Kelby was talking about. It's really frustrating, because when you join the law enforcement community, you join a brotherhood. You join a crew of people that you rely on, that hypervigilance and that need to do the job right and defend yourself. Really, the only people that you believe you can rely on when you're out on the street is somebody else in uniform that's got your back. And when you see incidents like this one that violate everything that we stand for, it's really frustrating to know that your brother in uniform is the person that did that.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that with us. Kelby, can you share maybe a little bit of your thoughts on it and kind of your initial reaction?
Yeah, it was very difficult to watch. The last question you talked about was misconceptions, and one thing that I want to make sure that I get across today to everyone that's watching or will watch in the future is nobody in law enforcement condones what happened. There's not a group, there's not a segment, a union, whatever you want to call it, or anyone saying this is okay. It clearly is not okay what happened, and hopefully it's dealt with in the appropriate manner, either in the court system in Minnesota or in the federal court system, wherever it may end. Clearly, it's caused a lot of pain. The thing for me is, talked earlier about these calls for service that we handle, domestic calls, suicidal subject calls, death investigations, where sometimes where people will kill each other. These calls are very painful, and it's just at the root of it, we're all human, and humans have a lot of things wrong with them. And this is just another shining example of that. And when I saw it, I knew there would be a lot of pain, a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, but it goes both ways. For me in law enforcement, I was angry about it because I knew that it was going to make our job more difficult and harder. Even though we're 1,500, 1,800 miles away from Minneapolis, I knew that we would feel the ramifications here because people are frustrated, they're upset. I can understand that. So for me, it's it's another bad incident that occurred, and obviously it's a criminal incident. I want to downplay it at all, but it definitely does affect us here locally and throughout the U.S. And you can see stuff around the world. It's just a terrible thing, and I knew that we were definitely going to have some rocky times ahead. Mitch kind of talked about Rodney King. There's been other incidents as well where law enforcement is kind of like a pendulum, and there'll be really good times. There'll be bad times. Clearly, the pendulum is in the bad segment right now. Officers, deputies, they go out for calls for service. Everyone's now watching more. They got their cameras out just on simple calls for service. They're trying to catch the next, incident, the next, bad act, if you will. And it makes the job tough on everybody. It does weigh on everybody. The men and women do definitely think about it, and because they want to do the best for the community. It's what we signed up for. It's kind of what Mitch talked about in his opening. We signed up to serve and protect, and these kind of incidents only make our job tremendously more tough.
Yeah. I wonder what insight the two of you could give us into, because surely you've had different conversations within your own with your own segments of the law enforcement community in these last couple of weeks? And obviously I'm not asking you to share anything that was shared in confidence, of course, but could you just give us a general sense of what is the tone of these conversations like as you're talking through both the incident itself, which was awful, but then also the ramifications of it. And as you have referenced, Kelby, as you guys have sort of had to reckon with the fact that this now makes your job a lot more difficult. Can you give us some insight? Maybe Kelby, we'll go back to you first, and then to Mitch. What are these conversations like, and what has it been like these last few weeks?
I think it's, you take a couple good steps forward in law enforcement, and you have some reform and some change that have gone in the last couple of years here in California. And then incidents like this occur, and it's like you go back like 20 years is what it feels like. You don't go back a couple steps. It feels like you go back years. Distrust in law enforcement. The community obviously is upset. I don't blame them. But on the other hand, the men and women here and inside Roseville PD, and also I know in law enforcement as well, are frustrated because they're not like that though too. And I think that's the point that people want to convey is that, there's a very large majority in law enforcement that do a great job daily. And I think that's the thing that we need to also keep in mind. Obviously there's bad actors, and those situations have started to work themselves out over time, but there's a large majority that signed up to do the right thing, and they continue to do it. One thing is, we had some riots and protests and demonstrations in downtown Sacramento, and we sent some folks down to that. And you could see the pain in people's faces going down to that because they knew what they were going to see. Obviously, there were people down there that were protesting and demonstrating. They were doing everything right, but there were people down there that wanted to cause damage and loot and throw frozen water bottles at officers and bottles full of urine and other things at officers as well. And that stuff's hard to deal with when you're trying to keep the peace and people are acting out in that way. And you can definitely see the pain in people's faces lately and know that this is definitely a tough time. But we've experienced this, but we need to get better, and we need to get better as a whole, and that includes everybody. Everyone has a little piece, not just law enforcement, but everybody has a piece in the conversation. And I think maybe that's where somewhat we failed in the past. Is it's just been certain groups that have taken on the change, and it hasn't been the kind of change we needed for the long term. But I think everyone needs to have a voice and come together and try to reconcile things, because we clearly need it.
Yeah, no, that's well said. Thank you for sharing that. Mitch, how about you? What have your conversations been like?
A lot of frustration, and Kelby alluded to, feeling like you're taking leaps backward. And when you're working day in and day out in a law enforcement career, and you have the conversations that you do every day, you feel like you don't want to just mark ground. You want to do things every day that are going to help improve the career, that are going to help improve the communication between you and the community. And a lot of law enforcement agencies have, enacted community resource organizations within their agencies to do a better job of communicating with the public and finding out what the public really wants and needs from their agency. And so when you feel like you're doing that on a regular basis, and then something like this happens, and you're like, man, we're 20 years back again. How do we keep ending up here? It's super, super frustrating for the guys that are in the career. And that's the general tone of the conversations. Is it feels like we do so many things to address. And I know California Post, Peace Officer Standards and Training, does a great job of setting standards for statewide for law enforcement agencies here. And so a lot of the things that we do, we feel like we're addressing these kind of issues, and yet it keeps happening. So there's the primary tone of those conversations is frustration.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's important for us to hear that. Go ahead, Lance.
Let me add something, because my heart is so big and sensitive towards both the law enforcement community and the minority community. There's one thing that has really been intriguing to me and maddening, and that is, I was talking with Bishop Parnell Lovelace. Recently, we were having, and he obviously has close ties to Bridgeway, African American, significant leader, amazing man. And we were talking about the difference between protests and rioting. And he was talking about the looting and the vandalism. He said it maligns the message, it ruins the message, which the right protesting is creating all the necessary, effective, helpful things, and the other one ruins it. In the same way, I look at my law enforcement community, and I see a bunch of officers trying really, really hard to make things right, and then this thing goes down and it maligns the message and ruins it, and feels like you start all over again. And so that same idea of saying, I know so many that are trying so hard and some are wrecking it. And that's what's so frustrating for me. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that out.
Yeah. Well, and that seems to me to be a pretty good comparison. Maybe just Kelby, could you maybe speak to that? I mean, does that does that comparison jive with you? Does that make sense? Is that a fair way of sort of communicating kind of the heart behind people in these different communities and maybe their frustration at those who are maligning the message?
Yeah. So in Roseville, we've had some protests and demonstrations recently. Last week, I ran our emergency operations center for the PD for several days, and we had protests and demonstrations. And it's our constitutional right to do stuff like that. And people came out and did it, and they had their messages. And I get the frustration. I also see the pain in their faces as well too, working those events, and that's important. I think what Pastor Lance said is very accurate. So you have people that then loot, they riot. There clearly is a difference between the two. Law enforcement is well aware that a majority of the people that go out and protest and demonstrate, they leave. There are people that stay behind and they want to do bad things, and it does take away from the voice or the message that they're trying to pass on, and it's that's frustrating, and I can see where people will be extremely frustrated about that. We also don't want to deal with it either. No one wants to have bottles of urine and water thrown at them. And I just want to be clear, that didn't happen in Roseville, but it did happen in other places. The looting, the violence, and breaking the businesses and stuff like that. That clearly takes away from the message. But what Pastor Lance said it is true. When you have bad actors in law enforcement and these kind of things do take place, it just feels like it takes us back, like I said earlier, like 20 years, and it takes forever to gain that ground back, that trust back. And I really think that that's something the law enforcement's always going to struggle with.
Yeah, well, and I think it's so important to hear the two of you talking about that, to say that, listen, day in and day out, law enforcement agencies all over the world are A, just trying to do their jobs to serve and protect their communities, and B, are trying to get better at preventing these types of incidents and making them so they don't happen. And that there is extraordinary frustration within the law enforcement community when these types of things occur for that exact reason. I mean, I think it's interesting, as we've, Pastor Lance and I have sought to have these conversations, and he's had them on a much larger scale than I have, but even just things that he and I have done publicly where we're trying to help kind of people in our own area understand the pain being expressed by a lot of these protesters. It's amazing the percentage of the negative comments are, oh yeah, but they're looting and they're rioting. But they're looting and they're rioting. And it's as if the looting and the rioting, it is enough to cause people to reject the message of the people that are doing it peacefully and communicating real pain. And like on some level, I sympathize with that like I don't sympathize with people that are looting and rioting, and I'm less inclined to listen when that goes on. So I think it's just important to recognize that that there's frustration within, amongst the peaceful protesters for those that are resorting to violence. And there's extraordinary frustration in the law enforcement community towards those who are behind these different types of incidents. And I think that can help us recognize, again, that the vast majority of people in both communities are really trying to do things right. Now, one interesting element that we discussed yesterday, Kelby, we had a little kind of pre-meeting to talk about the episode. There's obviously been a lot of talk in the media and different places about police reform. And something you were highlighting to me was that the state of California is already actually doing a lot of the things that are getting a lot of attention nationally and are really kind of ahead of the game in terms of really preparing police officers to be successful in their communities and to prevent these types of incidents. There's been a lot of language around kind of this or a lot of discussion around 8 can't wait and things to that effect. Could you talk maybe about that a little bit and about what's happening in the state of California, just to educate us a little bit on how officers are being kind of prepared to deal with these types of things?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. It's a very important point that I want people to be able to understand that we're already doing a lot of what is the message behind the 8 can't wait. So de-escalation requirements, we have statewide training. For those of you that aren't familiar, there's the California Peace Officer Standard and Training Commission. They do a really good job of pushing out training to law enforcement to make sure that we can do the best job for our communities daily. So de-escalation requirements, they've definitely stepped up their game with that. One of the other things is that's in the 8 can't wait is requirement warning before shooting. A lot of California agencies already have deadly force application policies where that's already covered in there. Duty to intervene. So that's probably one for me that's frustrating, because I hear people saying, officers, they don't have to intervene, they don't have to do anything. A lot of policies, I'm pretty sure I can speak for Mitch's agency, is very progressive, just like ours is. You have to intervene. We already have a policy for that. And I think that's important for people to know. Require comprehensive reporting. That's another one under the 8 can't wait that we already have. Our agency, a lot of agencies around have already banned the carotid use of force application technique. Shooting at moving vehicles. There's very restrictive policies on that. Agencies statewide in California. The use of force continuum that our post has required for us to train is very dynamic. It's a lot of the stuff that's covered, or that 8 can't wait wants to have covered, is already being done in our state. I think that's important to know. There's a lot of messages that come out. There's, what gains attention, and I think it's like you go back to the peaceful protesters. That doesn't attract attention on the media. A peaceful protest. What does? Looting, rioting, violence, burning a business. That's what everyone's being pushed out. Bad actors in law enforcement. The incident in Minneapolis. That's what's being pushed out. So people are being worn down with these negative messages when there's a lot of training already going on. California is very progressive, in my opinion, when it comes to law enforcement training and experience. But unfortunately, that stuff does not sell. It does not. It doesn't gain viewership. It's the bad actors kind of on both sides that's pushing the narrative, and I think people are seeing that over and over and over again, and they feel like that's all that's going on when it's not true. There's a lot of good police work that's been done in the past, and a lot going on right now. And our communities need to know that, and I think it's important to know that. Like I mentioned earlier, that there's some good points in the 8 can't wait and some of the other legislation that is being proposed, but everyone's got to have a piece or say at the table as well, and there needs to be understanding on both sides. It just can't be just one side just changing everything, because that's not going to work either.
Yeah, ultimately, reform has to involve everybody, right?
Yes.
And in any instance where we're just asking one group of people to, it's unilateral. It doesn't work. It has to involve all of us. Now, one element of this that maybe Mitch you could speak to, that there's been a lot of talk about kind of partnerships or the need to involve various types of community resources in law enforcement and policing and all of that. The two of you both kind of shared with me yesterday about partnerships that exist between your departments and mental health services in the area. Mitch, could you just share with us a little bit about what sort of partnerships exist already, and how kind of law enforcement is leveraging those partnerships to just to be able to serve the community better in a more holistic way?
Sure. So it's been at least 10 years, I believe, that the department's had a crisis response team where it pairs mental health clinicians with officers, and it provides training for officers to have different levels of more expertise with them, and be trained in better ways to understand mental health issues, so that when a call comes up and it looks like it might be mental health related, we field teams that are going to go and deal with that and bring that clinician with them. I believe Kelby's organization does this as well. So that's just one of the things that we've done. I think it's been at least 10 years that we've been operating that team.
So for us, Brian, we have we work with the Placer County Adult System of Care and also the Children's System of Care. And they have two teams, one for juveniles, one for adults and families. And they can respond out and help officers out in the field in our county with these type of situations. We kind of spoke about yesterday, and some of the information I was giving you is, law enforcement's, the foot in the door for these problems, but they're not fully trained for it, where MCT, they can come out and they can start dealing with it down the road, where law enforcement kind of does the intro, MCT can kind of pick it up and go forward from there and really get people the care and assistance they need, because the long term is what's needed, and that's what's kind of broken in our state, and we don't really have that right now. We have bits and pieces of it, we just don't have enough. But I think these partnerships like that our agency has with Placer County and like Sacramento County Sheriff's Department has as well, I think they're great starts. But it's stuff that's been going on, but again, that's not a popular narrative to talk about right now. It's an important one that needs to happen, but the agencies that already have it and things like that, it feels like that's not a popular thing to discuss when agencies are already doing something, when there's a lot of frustration about it, and we're already taking action on it, and we have been for years.
Yeah. One thing that this brings up as well for me is this idea that when I was on the ride along, I don't think that people understand how much the law enforcement community interacts with mental health. I think that especially in terms of, even if you're talking about emergency rooms, and how much emergency rooms also deal with mental health, and that takes a very specially trained person to deal with it very well. And so any partnerships we can do with social services and mental health along with policing is always going to be a better idea.
Yeah, it's certainly not, pardon the cliche, not an either or. It's a both and for sure. I would imagine all of you would agree with that sentiment. And you're right, Kelby. I mean, I think it gets in the news when maybe there's a part of the country where the partnership doesn't exist, or we see some of the negative ramifications of a partnership not existing. But you're right, a system whereby a person who has a mental health challenge can be resourced properly if a police officer comes on the scene. That doesn't make for a very exciting 60-second clip on the evening news, right? But it's critical. It's transformational. So just to know that happens is huge. Now we're starting to kind of come to a close here. Lance, I want to ask you about something, just because there has been obviously a lot, nationally, about just tension between the African American community and the law enforcement community. But you've been involved in a lot of conversations, both regionally and nationally, with pastors, with law enforcement, with just community officials, and all of this stuff. I wonder if you could share a little bit of just this question I'm going to ask, and then Kelby and Mitch would be interested to hear from you as well. In the midst of the tension, there's a lot of signs of progress. There's a lot of signs of solidarity. There's a lot of signs of large segments of both communities that really desire the same thing. What signs of progress, Lance, are you starting to see in terms of both communities really working together for some of the same goals?
Yeah, so even locally, we can go back to something that was started by Bishop Sherwood Carthen back in Sacramento PD. He started Cops and Clergy. That was the idea of uniting and linking within the community, of dealing with certain things like gang issues and things like that, where the side by side, the clergy would stand along with law enforcement, so that it would be more of not necessarily simply policing, but community service. And I think that type of unity that got started actually has seeds that are still growing. I think that the idea that we are having, unfortunately, a lot of things have to be forced, but we end up having conversations now with more people at the table. I think that is incredibly beneficial. I watched a bunch of protests launch in Folsom and El Dorado Hills that were done by young people, and they were done right. They were done with a lot of peacefulness. And even these young protesters demanded everyone wear a mask because they were concerned about public safety. And so I'm watching these 19, 20, and 21-year-olds telling everyone else to be responsible. And so just this whole idea, there is a lot of forward momentum because once again, the protests that are right it is not simply the Black community having to do it alone. These are very mixed groups. That I think is a huge advance that didn't used to be the case. So I am very optimistic about a lot of the changes and reforms and honestly, the same idea, and it's not a solution. And once again, this gentleman, although he's a friend of mine, he's still human, right? And that is Chief Daniel Hahn of the Sacramento PD, being an African-American gentleman and understanding and working on both sides. Now, he's also critiqued on both sides, right? So he can never win. But my point is, he is interested in developing reform and at the same time seeing it from the inside out. So I'm watching churches come together. I'm watching agencies come together. So I'm actually very hopeful on a lot of this. But wow, there's so much pain and devastation and hurt. It is not going to go away quickly.
Yeah. Mitch, how about you? We'll go to you and then Kelby. What signs of progress and kind of what signs of hope are you seeing?
Well, specifically with some things that I know my agency's doing, the sheriff has a SOCAB, a Sheriff's Outreach Community Advisory Board, that's made up of community members throughout the community, selected by boards of supervisors. Regional incorporated cities that want to send somebody to SOCAB can go there. And it's a really diverse representation of the community that can speak directly to the sheriff. He meets with them. Obviously, during COVID, he hasn't been able to meet with them in person, but he gets really good direct involvement with community members from all walks of life within the community. So that's a good open line of communication that has existed for a while now, and I think that's really doing some good. We also have a couple of units, the Youth Services Unit, and what was the other one? Oh, the Sheriff's Activities League. They're both 501c3 organizations that we put a lot of effort into making sure that we're getting communication and involvement with all of the communities within Sacramento County, but specifically we want to focus on being able to reach people that aren't like us and open lines of communication with them and be able to enjoy time with them. The Activities League spends a lot of time using sporting activities to gain trust and communication with kids, because we know that those kids are going to grow up to be adults that are going to be leaders in this community at some point. And if we can open those lines of communication with them early, then we're going to be able to have a more meaningful, open, trustworthy conversation later.
Oh, that's great. Kelby, how about you?
Yeah, so we have the Roseville Police Athletic League, which is very similar to what Mitch talked about as well. We also do, and I don't want to go into that since Mitch kind of covered it, but we do a parent project as well that gives tools and techniques for parents and siblings to conflict resolution. I think those type of programs are very important. We also have all of our neighborhood associations where the active ones, when they have meetings, an officer can come out and meet with the community. I think that's really important. I look back, I started here in 1997, and we had a gentleman that worked here named Bill Hughes. And I think he was the first mayor of Citrus Heights, and he was on their city council, and he was a great man. And we have a park in town named after him, and we won awards for community policing. And, it's important to keep that up and to keep that going, because obviously we work for the citizens, but we need to have that partnership with them. And it's been going on for a long time, and I think it's something that we need to continue to work on as well. you can always get better in that area. Communication is key in life, and is definitely key in the law enforcement profession as well. One thing that I just want to talk about real quick is that, I know we're running out of time, is the overwhelming support that our agency has received from the community lately. People dropping off items, food, drinks, you name it, donuts, all kinds of stuff that have been dropped off lately. Unfortunately, and I've known people that have been killed that have been in the law enforcement community that have been my friends. We've had officers here that have passed away as well. And the overwhelming amount of support we've received over the last 10 days has been tremendous, to say the least. Our community has been great. We love the community, they love us, but it's those kind of things that aren't really talked about. But I just want to throw it out there. All the agencies in Placer County, and I know in Sacramento County, definitely appreciate the support. And that's, I'm just here to say thank you to all the great people that have been just really showing love and compassion on the police department. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really glad you shared that.
Amen. Amen. I got a question for you before we run out of time. And once again, I tend to question and prod my closest friends and family. So because I love you guys, I have to push your buttons. That's the way it works. So here's a question. One of my big frustrations, and largely it's because of ignorance, because I don't understand, is that there seems to be this code of blue protecting blue. And that ends up allowing bad apples to exist for a long time. You also have a chain of command structure. So, for example, when the officer, Derek Chauvin, did what he did to Mr. Floyd, you had 3 other officers there who have been told every other day, this is your commanding officer, this is the guy that's training you, you need to do what he tells you to do. And so once again, some of them said they said something, but really it didn't have much effect. And this whole idea of police not policing themselves is out there, because you go, well, wait a second, we're not moving forward because there's still an internal protection of oneself. And yet on this call right here, not only Lieutenant Kelby, you're involved in stuff like this, but Mitch, you were part of the internal affairs. You were part of that exact process of holding police accountable. So can you guys share a little bit about how this goes down? Because when you guys wall off and try to protect one another, it makes it look like it's not being handled. But is it?
So I'll speak to it from a couple different perspectives. As a patrol guy, when I was out boots on the ground every day, I had several instances where I witnessed fellow officers physically restraining a partner or grabbing him by the shoulder and pulling him away from an incident over to a patrol car and say, hey, dude, sit down. It's time for you to cool off for a minute. So that kind of thing does happen. Sadly, it doesn't happen in every situation. Clearly, like the George Floyd incident, it should have happened and it didn't. From the internal affairs perspective, one of my biggest frustrations was seemingly a pretty minor issue that I was investigating would usually get the silent treatment. They would answer my questions as plainly and simply as they could to avoid getting somebody else in trouble or possibly getting themselves in trouble. I think a lot of that happens because people spend a lot of time and effort to get into the career, and they feel trapped in that situation. These are their friends, the people they spend 40 hours a week with, and to say something that would damage that relationship in any way, people have a really hard balance. That's a really hard balance in their life. So I do see it happening. And at the same time, I do see, and by happening, I mean, I do see the blue defending blue thing. I do see it happening, but I also see a lot of instances where officers are able to regulate themselves and their partners and make sure that the right thing does happen. As far as the disciplinary side, the state of California protects officers in some instances from just making public shows of every disciplinary issue. I don't think that you as clergy or anybody in any career would want their internal discipline issues aired to the public. So that seems reasonable to me in most circumstances. There are circumstances where maybe an internal affairs investigation should be more publicly known, depending on the behavior that was uncovered. But the issues do get addressed. I saw a lot of discipline handed out. I think the first 2 years, I could be misspeaking here, but I think the first 2 years that Scott was the sheriff, he actually terminated 54 employees based off of internal affairs investigations. So that process does work.
Wow. Kelby, how about you? What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
so for us, it all starts with a way for the community or a citizen that feels like they've been mistreated or had an issue with an officer to be able to have that voice to submit a complaint. So we're like a lot of agencies in the state. We have a professional standards unit. Typically, they encompass more duties, but your quote unquote, the IA division is in there as well. And all of our policies are online. That's another thing where I think California is ahead of the rest of the U.S. is our policies and things like that are online as a result of legislation that's come out of the last couple of years. And that process is definitely one that's well defined through the government code. And our IA division is obviously separate from the, in Roseville, they're in a whole different building. But I think to go back and reference kind of what Pastor Lance was saying about the blue covering the blue, I think that has gone on. And obviously there's been bad actors that I've spoken about, but I think that's a term that's never going to go away. And I think that's a jacket that law enforcement's always going to wear, whether it's right or wrong. And I think it's I think it's something that where people can just say, oh, you just cover for each other. I think that's a very grandiose type statement. I don't think it's applicable. There are bad things that go on. I think Mitch and I have been very honest about this and upfront about it. And those things need to be dealt with. And the same examples Mitch has had over the years, I've seen as well and participated in also. But to say that the people are covering for people, one of the biggest things that's out there are cell phones and videos, and we do a lot of effort to investigate all of the complaints that come in to our agency, and I have a lot of faith and trust in what goes on, but importantly, the public needs to have that as well too. So if anybody out there that's watching that wants to go in and see our policies and our use of force numbers and stuff like that, it'll be on our website. You just go to the city of Roseville, hit the police department, and all of our stuff is on there, and it's very very easy to see, and you can read all about it.
And if I could add one thing that just clicked in my head about that, when I was those 5 years in internal affairs, I tracked all the stats that we had every year on what was happening, and a good chunk of our complaints coming into internal affairs were internally generated. That means officers were formally filling out a complaint and sending it into internal affairs based on something they saw while they were working. So
that's what I'm saying. That's the stuff that needs to be clear, that there is some internal policing going on, and I don't think that's popularly known. I think there is an idea that, and once again, I think that so for example, there's been a lot of challenge throughout many decades of clergy doing improper things. And that's popularly, they're all corrupt. Well, we're doing an awful lot of policing, and a ton of us are getting fired if things go out of, but we don't tend to publicize the internal investigation of it, because once again, it ends up maligning a bunch of the good guys along the way. And that gives other people that just simply don't like it more fodder to create a problem. So I understand why you don't always desire to make everything public, but I do think it's important for the public to know there is self-policing agency going on.
Definitely going on.
Yeah, and I completely agree. It's really important, and I think on some level you talk about blue defending blue and all of that. I think in any of our professions, there's an extent to which we can say, okay, I'm defending my colleague here from maybe public scrutiny or what the public is saying, because I work in that same profession. The public simply does not understand. If they understood what we knew, you would recognize that this is okay, this is appropriate, or whatever. And then there's a whole separate side of things which says, okay, my colleague has engaged in a serious dereliction of their duty, whether they're in law enforcement or clergy or whatever, and like that needs to be handled. And that's not something I'm going to defend. There is a massive difference between those two perspectives, and I think it's easy for the public sometimes to conflate them, and that's obviously not helpful. So I appreciate the two of you sharing just about the extent to which kind of internal accountability is happening. Now, very last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll be done, is just, okay, we're all Christ followers here. We're active in our local church and all of that. And, Kelby, I'm really glad you shared about the community support that you guys have experienced. And I hope everyone was able just to hear that. But I would love for each of you, and we'll start with you, Kelby, and then Mitch, could you just give us a little bit of a picture of how can we as Christians, how can we as the church continue to support those of you who serve our communities so bravely in law enforcement? What comes to mind?
I think some of the things we've talked about today. So obviously there's a lot of good that goes on in law enforcement, and I think that's not talked about enough. But the support that I talked about is great. People. I'll give you an example. I went to Starbucks the other day. I don't drink coffee, but I will definitely drink iced tea. So I went and got an iced tea, and I had like 4 people fighting over to want to buy me an iced tea at this local Starbucks. And it's stuff like that. It's not that we need stuff bought for us, but it's that people do care, and they show it in different ways. How can the church do it is kind of what I think more you're headed towards. But I think just taking time and just, we're getting a lot of information pushed at us at different angles. Everybody is social media, the news, friends. One side, this side. I think the main thing that we can do, law enforcement included, is to not be divisive and to engage, build bridges, and have good communication and dialogue. I think that's very important. And I think that's some of what we're missing right now. It's more about the violence, this person said this comment, or this narrative is being pushed. I think people just need to kind of step back, hit the pause button, take a deep breath, and kind of just examine things and have these conversations with their neighbors, fellow people that they go with at church, coworkers. I think the communication's vital, and I think that's definitely something that I would encourage our Bridgeway family to. Really, it's about community, and someone likes to has preached about that over the years. And I think that's very important. And I think we're definitely in a time where we need more community, and we need to have more conversation. And just as much as communicating, we need to sit back and listen as well too, and just kind of understand where everyone's coming from.
Amen.
That's great. Very well said. Mitch, how about you?
So I'll try and speak directly to your listener as an individual and not in broader terms. You asked, what can we as Christians do? And it kind of doubles back on the book that we talked about earlier, the Kevin Gilmartin, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. Some of the things that law enforcement officers need to do is have really healthy boundaries and ways to interact with the public that aren't law enforcement related. So friends and family, neighbors, organizations that they can get involved in, those are really healthy for them. All those organizations have other people, neighbors, citizens that are in them. So if you're a Christian and you know somebody in your circle of influence that's a law enforcement officer, then we appreciate the gestures of support, buying an iced tea or a coffee, or just a smile or a wave on the street. But if you know an officer personally, make an effort to reach out to them on a regular basis and check up on them, see how they're doing. invite them out for a conversation. Be that part of the emotional support system that they need, because they will, if they trust you, they'll open up to you and they'll talk to you. And that's what they really need to do. A lot of counseling can be informal counseling with a friend, and just the ability to vent and discuss and air things that you're feeling are going to help create that balance for that officer.
Yeah, that's great. And just what the two of you are sharing, I mean, just the power of conversation and seeking understanding and checking in on, I mean, this is all stuff we've heard. But man, there's such power in it. So, well, I've been referring to you both by your first names all casually all episode, but Lieutenant Newton and Deputy Andrews, thank you so much for your time today. And more than that, thank you so much for your service to our community. We love you. We appreciate you very much. And you've shared a lot of wisdom with us today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
And thank you for what Bridgeway does for the Roseville Police Department. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. You know what? I mean, just the beautiful wisdom that you guys shared and the transparency and authenticity. These are the voices that I want to highlight. So I'm so thankful and proud of both of you. And I consider it an honor just to be friends with you. So thank you very much for your service. Awesome.
Yep, absolutely. And thank you to all of you for listening. Thank you to Lucian and to Brenton for taking the audio and the video and getting it where it needs to be and making it sound good. Thanks again to all of you. We'll see you again in 2 weeks for another episode of Engaging Culture. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Engaging Culture, a podcast by Bridgeway Christian Church. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and leaving a review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening. Music is used under the Creative Commons license and is provided by Dexter Britton.